Welcome, dear readers, to a journey through time and the human heart. Today we will immerse ourselves in the mists of the English winter of 1881, where aristocratic salons kept secrets as deep as the sea that bathed the coast of Brighton. This is the story of Charlotte Whitmore, a young woman who dared to defy the conventions of her time in the name of true love. Imagine walking through the frozen corridors of a Victorian mansion, where every whisper resonates like an unfulfilled promise, where a simple glance can change the destiny of two souls. Are you ready to discover how silence can speak louder than 1,000 words? Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching us from? I'd like to get to know our readers scattered around the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like so more people can discover these exciting stories that cross the centuries. Brighton, England, winter 1881. Ashford Mansion, where the waves of the English Channel whisper secrets to the frozen winds. Snow fell in heavy flakes over the gardens of Ashford Mansion, creating a white blanket that muffled the sounds of the outside world. Inside the golden salons where candles flickered like imprisoned stars, Charlotte Whitmore adjusted for the 10th time the silk gloves that wrapped her trembling hands. The navy blue velvet dress, with its silver embroidered details, embraced her delicate silhouette like a second skin. It was her first time as official hostess of a ball in the mansion that had welcomed her since she was 16, when orphanhood made her Sir William Ashford's ward. The echo of her breathing mixed with the distant murmur of guests who already filled the great hall. Through the heavy oak doors, she could hear the soft melody of the string quartet, each note floating like a caress through the winter air. "Miss Charlotte," whispered Mrs. Pemberton, approaching with the care of one who fears breaking something precious. "It's time." Charlotte nodded, her grey-green eyes reflecting the golden light of the candelabras. There was something in the atmosphere of that night that made her heart beat like the wings of a caged bird, an anticipation she couldn't name. When the doors opened, revealing the hall in all its magnificence, Charlotte felt the weight of dozens of gazes settling upon her. Among the familiar faces of Brighton's high society, one stood out: Lady Constance Fairfax, a widow of barely 25, whose refined beauty and considerable fortune made her the center of attention wherever she went. But it was another gaze that found hers across the elegant crowd, the deep and enigmatic gaze of Sir William, who watched her from the corner of the hall with an expression she couldn't decipher. In that moment, something subtle but definitive changed in the air between them, as if an invisible door had been left ajar. The night had just begun, but Charlotte already sensed that nothing would be the same after that winter snow falling outside, covering the known world with its silent and transformative beauty. The orchids arrived the following morning, exotic and perfumed, bringing with them the aroma of the East Indies and a card signed simply F. Morrison. Charlotte held the flowers against her chest, feeling her heart race not from the beauty of the orchids, but from the memory of Captain Frederick Morrison's dark eyes during the previous night's waltz. He was different from the other suitors. There was in him a worldly sophistication, stories of distant lands etched in the fine lines around his eyes. During the dance, he had told her about the turquoise seas of the Orient, about golden temples and spices that perfumed colorful markets. But even as her delicate hands arranged the orchids in the crystal vase, Charlotte couldn't banish from her mind the image of William abruptly interrupting his conversation with Lady Constance to ask her for that last dance. There was something in the way he had led her across the floor, his firm fingers on her waist, that made her skin tingle even now, under the soft morning light. Mrs. Pemberton entered the room silently, as she always did. "The flowers are beautiful, dear," she said, but there was a note of concern in her maternal voice. "Captain Morrison seems to be a determined young man." Charlotte nodded, turning toward the window where she could see William walking through the snow-covered gardens. Even from afar, there was something in his posture that suggested tension, as if he carried an invisible weight on his broad shoulders. "Mrs. Pemberton," murmured Charlotte, "sometimes I feel there are unspoken things in this house. Secrets that float through the corridors like ghosts." The governess hesitated, her wrinkled hands smoothing her apron. "Some truths, my dear, reveal themselves only when we're ready to bear them." Through the fogged glass, Charlotte saw Lady Constance approaching William in the garden, her red velvet cape contrasting dramatically with the whiteness of the snow. The way she touched his arm, intimate and possessive, made something contract painfully in Charlotte's chest. It was in that moment that she began to understand that the awakening of her feelings would be only the beginning of a journey much more complex and dangerous than she had imagined. The book appeared on her table 3 days later, a leather-bound volume of Sonnets from the Portuguese by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. When Charlotte opened it, she discovered annotations in the margins, written in the firm and elegant handwriting she immediately recognized as William's. Next to the verse, "How do I love thee, let me count the ways," he had written a single word, "eternally." Her hands trembled as she held the book. It was impossible that this annotation was directed at her, but something in her heart insisted otherwise. For days she carried the volume with her, rereading the marginal annotations that seemed to form a silent conversation between two souls. It was Mrs. Pemberton who discreetly suggested that Charlotte might also leave her own impressions about the poetry. "Sometimes," said the governess with a subtle smile, "books are bridges between hearts that dare not meet directly." Charlotte began writing her own notes on the pages, responding to William's comments with observations that revealed the depth of her thoughts and the sensitivity of her soul. When she returned the book to the library, leaving it strategically on the table where William usually worked, her hands were sweating inside her lace gloves. The exchange became a sacred ritual. Every 2 days the book changed places, always with new annotations, as if two minds were touching through the poetry of a woman who had dared to love beyond the conventions of her time. It was during one of those secret exchanges that Charlotte realized she was being watched. Lady Constance was at the library door, her blue eyes shining with dangerous intelligence. "Interesting choice of reading," she said, approaching with calculated steps. "Elizabeth Browning was an incorrigible romantic, wasn't she? I always believed love should be more practical." Charlotte closed the book against her chest, feeling as if she were protecting something sacred. There was in Constance's voice a subtle threat, an understanding that something precious was being threatened. That night, when she found a new annotation from William, "True poetry is born when two souls recognize their common language," Charlotte knew that their secret correspondence had become more dangerous and more necessary than she had ever imagined. The revelation came like lightning on a clear day. Mr. Thornbury, the family lawyer, adjusted his glasses and reread the document for the 3rd time, as if the words might change under his perplexed gaze. "Miss Whitmore," he finally said, "I must inform you that at 21, which you will turn next month, you will inherit a considerable sum left by your paternal uncle, Henry Whitmore. The inheritance has been administered by Sir William since your parents' death." Charlotte felt the world tilt slightly around her. For 5 years, she had believed herself completely dependent on William's generosity, an orphan without resources of her own. The sitting room, with its mahogany furniture and brocade curtains, seemed to acquire a dreamlike quality. "Why was I never told?" she asked, her voice no more than a whisper. William, who had remained silent during the meeting, finally spoke. "I wanted to protect you from that responsibility until you were ready to assume such a burden." But there was something in his eyes that Charlotte couldn't interpret. Relief? Sadness? Fear? That night, she found William in the library, standing before the window that looked out onto the dark gardens. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a crystalline world under the full moon's light. "You hid my own life from me," she said, approaching slowly. "I hid it from the world's cruelty," he replied without turning. "A young woman with fortune becomes a target for predators she may not be able to recognize." "Like Frederick Morrison?" The name floated between them like an accusation. William turned then, and Charlotte saw in his face a vulnerability she had never noticed before. "Like any man who might see in you only the numbers in a bank account." The distance between them seemed simultaneously insurmountable and non-existent. Charlotte felt she was on the threshold of an understanding that would change everything. About William, about herself, about the complex nature of protection and control. "And you?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "What do you see in me?" The question hung in the air like the snowflakes of the previous night, beautiful and fragile, waiting to settle on safe ground or melt before finding its destiny. The letters were hidden behind a row of volumes on moral philosophy, yellowed by time and tied with a faded silk ribbon. Charlotte discovered them by chance when looking for a book for her secret correspondence with William. The handwriting on the first letter made her heart jump. It was identical to her own. "My dear Margaret," read the heading in faded ink. Margaret, her mother. With trembling hands, Charlotte untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters revealed a story they had never told her, of a young Margaret Whitmore, promised in an arranged marriage to a man she didn't love, but hopelessly in love with another, Charlotte's father. "William understands my situation better than anyone," Margaret wrote in one of the letters. "He himself bears the weight of family expectations that suffocate the soul. That's why when I say I choose love over duty, he doesn't judge me, only wishes me happiness." Charlotte discovered that William had helped her parents elope together, facing the social scandal that followed. More than that, he had protected the Whitmore family's reputation, bearing alone the social consequences of having facilitated what society considered a disgrace. "Dear William," said the last letter, "I know you pay a price for your goodness. I promise that if anything happens to us, you will care for our Charlotte not out of obligation, but because you will recognize in her the same free spirit that led me to choose true love." When Charlotte finished reading, silent tears ran down her face. She finally understood that William had protected her, not from unrequited love toward her mother, but from genuine honor and a deep sense of duty toward those who dared to follow their hearts. The library door opened softly and William entered, stopping abruptly when he saw her with the letters in her hands. "You read them," he said simply. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because," he approached slowly, "I wanted you to know you were loved for yourself, not as an echo of someone else." In that moment, Charlotte understood that the secret of the past was not just about her parents, but about William having spent years caring for her while bearing alone the memories of a sacrifice that had defined his entire adult life. The truth, like the snow accumulating on the windowsills, had finally found its visible form. Frederick Morrison's proposal arrived wrapped in silk and perfumed with jasmine essence from the Indies. He sought her in the conservatory during the grey Sunday afternoon, when rain beat against the glass like impatient fingers. "Miss Charlotte," he said, kneeling among the orchids he had sent days before, "would you do me the honor of accepting my hand in marriage?" But there was something in his eyes that didn't match the solemnity of the moment, an urgency that didn't seem born of passion. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine, an instinct that alerted her to something wrong. "Captain Morrison," she responded carefully, "your proposal is very honorable, but I need time to consider." It was then that he stood up, and the words that came from his mouth changed everything. "I must confess something to you, Miss Charlotte. Lady Constance Fairfax sought me out and offered a substantial dowry if I secured your hand. Initially, I must admit, that's what motivated my interest. But," he hurried to add, seeing the expression of horror on her face, "my feelings became genuine." The conservatory seemed to spin around Charlotte. The exotic flowers that had once symbolized romance now revealed themselves as trophies of a carefully orchestrated manipulation. "Lady Constance," she murmured, the puzzle pieces fitting together with painful clarity. "She wishes Sir William to be free for other arrangements," Frederick admitted, lowering his eyes. Charlotte felt a cold fury spreading through her veins, like the ice forming on the windows. Lady Constance not only saw her as an obstacle, she saw her as a piece to be removed from the board through bribery and manipulation. That night she confronted Constance in the main salon, where the widow was taking tea as if she were the lady of the house. "You underestimated my intelligence, Lady Fairfax," said Charlotte, her voice cutting like winter wind. Constance smiled, placing the porcelain cup delicately on the saucer. "My dear, I only offered the young captain an opportunity for prosperity. If he accepted it, that says more about his character than mine." "And about William? What's your game regarding him?" "Game?" Constance laughed softly. "Dear Charlotte, a man of William's position needs a wife appropriate to his social station. You are a lovely ward, but he needs a companion of his stature." The words were pronounced with the precision of daggers wrapped in silk. Charlotte understood she was facing not just a rival, but an adversary willing to use any means to achieve her objectives. The storm forming outside was nothing compared to the one beginning to rage within the elegant walls of Ashford Mansion. The storm arrived at dawn like a primordial force, lashing the mansion's windows with winds that howled like souls in torment. Charlotte awoke to the crash of a door slamming somewhere in the house, and the sound of rain transformed into hail against the glass. By morning, she discovered that the storm had made the roads impassable. Fallen trees blocked the paths, and the bridge over the stream that connected the property to the town had been damaged by the force of the waters. Ashford Mansion was isolated from the outside world. "There's no way for the guests to leave today," announced Mrs. Pemberton during breakfast, but Charlotte noticed a worried gleam in her eyes when she mentioned that Lady Constance was among those prevented from travelling. The first day of isolation passed in almost palpable tension. Charlotte found herself constantly aware of William's presence in the same closed environments, as if the forced proximity had intensified every glance, every shared breath. It was during the second night that she found him in the library, standing before the fireplace where flames danced, projecting golden shadows on the bookshelves. The storm continued outside, but had diminished to a constant murmur against the windows. "Your mother's letters," he said without preamble, without turning to look at her. They didn't tell the whole truth. Charlotte approached slowly, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. "What truth?" "That I loved her." The words came out like a sigh, laden with years of silence. "That when she chose your father, part of me died. And that when you arrived here at 16, it was as if the universe offered me a second chance to protect someone who—" He turned then, and Charlotte saw in his eyes a vulnerability that made her heart race. "Someone who grew to become more precious to me than my own life." The confession floated between them, like the electricity that precedes lightning. Charlotte took a step forward, and then another, until she could feel the warmth emanating from his body. "William," she whispered, and when he extended his hand to touch her face, she didn't pull away. The moment that followed was suspended in time. Their lips approached, the fireplace flames reflecting in their eyes, the outside world ceasing to exist. It was then that the door burst open, and Lady Constance entered like an apparition of black velvet and deadly intentions. "Sir William," her voice cut the air like a blade, "the lawyers arrived this morning before the storm. Our engagement was officially announced in the London papers. The morning that followed Constance's announcement dawned with a silence heavier than the storm itself. Charlotte remained in her room until after midday, alternating between fury and a desperation that seemed to want to swallow her whole. Her inheritance. She had almost forgotten her own financial independence discovered days before. With determined hands, she began packing only the essentials: some clothes, the poetry book with William's annotations, and her mother's letters. Mrs. Pemberton found her preparing to leave. "Where are you going, dear child?" "To London. To my Aunt Helena's house." Charlotte didn't even know if Lady Helena Whitmore would receive her, but it was her only hope of escape from this suffocating situation. "And will you let Sir William marry that viper?" Charlotte stopped folding a dress, her hands trembling slightly. "He made his choice. He honors his social obligations, as he always has." But Mrs. Pemberton approached and gently held her chin, forcing her to look into her wise eyes. "Sometimes, my dear, running away is the only way to make someone realize what they're losing." The journey to London was a trial. Charlotte travelled alone in the carriage, through roads still damaged by the storm, carrying only a suitcase and a broken heart. With each mile she moved away from Brighton, she felt as if a part of herself were being torn away. Lady Helena Whitmore received her with surprise, but also with immediate perception of the situation. She was a woman of 50, a childless widow, known in London for her progressive ideas about women's rights. "So you fell in love with your guardian," she said without beating around the bush, serving tea in her elegant but uncomplicated sitting room. "And he fell in love with you, but feels obligated to honor a convenient social engagement." Charlotte nodded, surprised by her aunt's frankness. "My dear child," Lady Helena smiled, "you're too young to understand that sometimes true love demands that we fight for it, not run from it." For 2 months, Charlotte lived in London, trying to rebuild herself away from the suffocating atmosphere of Ashford Mansion. But every letter that Mrs. Pemberton sent her secretly brought news that made her heart contract. William had grown thin, spent hours walking alone through the gardens, and the wedding with Constance was scheduled for late spring. It was Lady Helena who finally forced Charlotte to face the truth she was trying to deny. "You can spend the rest of your life hiding in London," she told her one rainy afternoon, "or you can return and fight for the man you love. The choice is yours, but remember, regret is a much heavier companion than courage." The return to Brighton occurred on a May morning when the first wildflowers began to dot the fields along the road. Charlotte had sent only a laconic letter to Mrs. Pemberton, announcing her arrival but requesting absolute secrecy. Ashford Mansion seemed different in the spring light, gloomier, as if the very stones had absorbed the melancholy of its inhabitants. Charlotte was received at the back of the house by Mrs. Pemberton, who embraced her as if she were a daughter lost long ago. "He's not the same anymore," whispered the governess. "He eats little, sleeps even less. Lady Constance is here frequently, planning the wedding, but he treats her with such cold courtesy that even she realizes something is wrong." "Where is he now?" "In the library." Always in the library, reading the same books repeatedly. Charlotte found him exactly where she expected, sitting in the leather armchair near the window, with Browning's poetry book open in his hands. He had visibly lost weight, and there were lines of fatigue around his eyes that weren't there 3 months before. When he saw her, the book fell from his hands, as if it had lost all substance. Charlotte. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer long rehearsed, but never spoken. "I came to prevent a mistake," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the heart that beat like a hummingbird's wings. "You don't understand." William rose slowly, as if carrying an invisible weight. "Social obligations, contracts already signed, the reputation of both families. I understand perfectly." Charlotte took a step forward and then another. "I understand that you're sacrificing yourself for a sense of honor that my own mother defied when she chose true love." She pulled a letter from her pocket, one that Lady Helena had helped her write during the long nights in London. "This is my formal declaration. I am now 21, in possession of my inheritance and completely financially independent. I am no longer your ward, William. I am a free woman who can choose for herself." William looked at the letter as if it could contain fire. "And my choice," continued Charlotte, her voice gaining strength, "is to fight for the man I love, even if that means facing all of Brighton society." The silence that followed was filled only by the distant murmur of the sea and the accelerated beating of two hearts that finally understood that some risks were worth more than all the conveniences in the world. The final confrontation occurred in the mansion's meeting room, an afternoon when lawyers from both families gathered to finalize the marriage contracts. Charlotte entered the room uninvited, wearing a navy blue traveling ensemble that enhanced her determination and independence. "Gentlemen," she said, addressing the surprised men around the mahogany table, "I beg pardon for the interruption, but there are matters that must be clarified before any document is signed." Lady Constance, seated next to William as if she were already his wife, raised an eyebrow in cold defiance. "Miss Whitmore, this is a private matter between a man I love and a woman who sees in him only a convenient title," interrupted Charlotte, her voice cutting. The silence that followed was palpable. William had risen slowly, his eyes fixed on Charlotte as if she were an apparition. "I declare publicly," continued Charlotte, now addressing him directly, "that I possess substantial inheritance of my own, complete financial independence, and that I choose Sir William Ashford not out of necessity, but for true and reciprocated love." One of the lawyers cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Whitmore, the contracts have already been—" "Contracts can be broken," said William, his voice sounding clear for the first time in months, "especially when they're based on false premises." Lady Constance rose abruptly, her face a mask of controlled fury. "William, you can't seriously be considering—" "I am considering," he said, walking to stand beside Charlotte. "Breaking an engagement I should have had the courage to refuse from the beginning." "The scandal will be immense," whispered one of the lawyers. "Then so be it," said Charlotte, extending her hand to William. "I prefer to face a scandal for true love than live a whole life of convenient lies." William took her hand, interlacing his fingers with a firmness that conveyed all the decision he had finally made. "Gentlemen, Lady Constance," he said formally, "I consider our engagement officially broken. I assume full responsibility for the social and financial consequences of this decision." Lady Constance left the room like a storm of silk and indignation, but not before casting one last venomous look at Charlotte. "You will pay dearly for this public humiliation." When the door closed behind her, Charlotte and William remained hand in hand in the center of the room, surrounded by embarrassed lawyers and broken contracts, but finally free to choose their own destiny. "It won't be easy," whispered William in her ear. Nothing valuable ever is, she replied, smiling for the first time in months. The weeks that followed the public breakup brought consequences that neither Charlotte nor William had completely anticipated. Brighton society divided into clear factions, those who considered Charlotte's behavior scandalous and William a dishonored gentleman, and a progressive minority who secretly admired the courage of both. Lady Constance, wounded in her pride, mobilized her influences to make the couple's social life unbearable. Invitations were withdrawn, greetings became scarce on the streets, and whispers followed Charlotte wherever she appeared. It was Mrs. Pemberton who brought the most devastating news one rainy June morning. "Reverend Whitfield refuses to officiate the marriage," she said, her hands trembling slightly. Lady Constance pressured the church council. "They say it would be inappropriate to celebrate a union that began with the breaking of sacred commitments." Charlotte felt the world darken around her. They had overcome so many obstacles, only to discover that the very ceremony would be denied them. It was then that Lady Helena arrived from London, bringing with her not only moral support, but a discovery that would change everything. "I found this among Margaret's papers," she said, extending a bundle of yellowed letters. "These are letters your mother never got to send, written shortly before her death." Charlotte opened the first letter with trembling hands. Her mother's familiar handwriting danced before her eyes. "My dear Charlotte, if you are reading this, it means you grew up to become a woman brave enough to fight for your dreams. I want you to know that your choice of William has my posthumous blessing. He is a rare man, capable of genuinely loving and protecting without oppressing. If society criticizes you for following your hearts, remember that great loves have always defied small minds." The letter continued, revealing that Margaret had foreseen and approved the possibility of Charlotte and William falling in love. More than that, she had left specific instructions that, if this happened, they should receive all possible support. "There's more," said Lady Helena, smiling. Margaret left a list of influential people in London who shared her progressive views on marriages for love. Some of those people are now prominent figures in Parliament and the Church. Mrs. Pemberton, who had remained silent during the reading, finally spoke. "There's also Reverend Matthews from the Methodist Church in London. He was a close friend of your parents and always defended that true love is sacred, regardless of social conventions." For the first time in weeks, Charlotte felt hope reborn in her chest, like the first flowers after a harsh winter. "Then we'll fight," she said, looking at William. "If Brighton rejects us, we'll find who will accept us." The Methodist chapel in Kensington was decorated with white roses and green foliage on a golden August morning. It was small and simple compared to the great churches of Brighton, but there was in it an atmosphere of genuine sanctity that ornate cathedrals sometimes failed to achieve. Charlotte wore a champagne silk dress, simple but elegant, that had belonged to her mother. Lady Helena had insisted on lending it to her, saying that Margaret would symbolically approve of the choice. Her hair was gathered in a low chignon, adorned only with some fresh white roses. Reverend Matthews, a 70-year-old man with kind eyes, had agreed to celebrate the ceremony after reading Margaret's letters and having long conversations with the couple about their intentions and values. "True love," he had said during one of their preparatory conversations, "is a sacrament that transcends human conventions. If God blesses two souls who recognize each other, who are we to question it?" Among the guests present there was an eclectic mix. Lady Helena, radiant with maternal pride, Mrs. Pemberton moved to tears, some progressive friends from London that Lady Helena had mobilized, and surprisingly Captain Frederick Morrison. He had returned from the Indies 2 days before and sought out Charlotte to ask her forgiveness for his participation in Lady Constance's scheme. "I discovered what true love is in distant lands," he had said with sincerity, "and I recognize it when I see it in others. You have my blessing and admiration." When William entered the chapel, wearing an impeccable dark suit, Charlotte felt that all the obstacles they had faced were worth it just for that moment. There was in his eyes a peace she hadn't seen for months, the serenity of a man who had finally chosen to follow his heart instead of his social obligations. "I promise," said William, his voice clear in the silent chapel, "to love you not only as a wife but as a soul companion, respecting your intelligence, supporting your dreams, and building with you a future based on choice, not convention." "I promise," responded Charlotte, "to be your companion in all journeys, to face all challenges with you, and to love you not out of obligation, but by choice renewed each day. When the Reverend declared them husband and wife, the kiss they shared sealed not only their union, but the victory of love over all the conventions that tried to separate them. The vows they exchanged were written by themselves, words that reflected not only love but mutual respect, independence within union, and commitment to support each other against all adversities. The reception was simple, held in Lady Helena's garden, but there was in it a genuine joy that contrasted markedly with the formal and empty balls of Brighton society. While they danced under the August stars, Charlotte whispered in William's ear, "No matter what the future brings us." Today we won. 5 years later, September 1886, the garden of the Whitmore Ashford School for Young Orphans flourished under the soft late summer sun. Charlotte watched from her office window as the girls played in the flower beds that she and William had planted together in the first year after returning to Brighton. Her hand rested instinctively on her belly where their third child was growing, while the laughter of James, 4 years old, and Helena, 2, resonated from the garden where they played under the attentive care of Mrs. Pemberton. The school had been the joint project that gave renewed purpose to their lives after marriage. Using their combined inheritance, they transformed a property adjacent to Ashford Mansion into an institution that offered not only education, but a welcoming home for orphaned girls from all over England. "Mrs. Ashford," said Miss Caroline, the young teacher they had hired, "the delegation from London has arrived. They're impressed with our pedagogical methods." Charlotte smiled. The school had become a model for other similar institutions, proving that love and respect produced better educational results than the rigid discipline traditionally employed in orphanages. William entered the office at that moment, bringing with him the aroma of fresh ink and official papers. At 43, he had found new vocation as a legal defender of progressive causes, particularly related to women's and orphans' rights. "Parliament approved our proposal," he said, gently kissing Charlotte's face. "There will be government funding for schools like ours in 5 counties. Charlotte turned in his arms, admiring the silver threads that were beginning to appear at his temples, marks of a man who had found peace with his choices. "And what about our old acquaintances?" she asked with a mischievous smile. "Lady Constance married Lord Pemberton for convenience last year. They say it's an appropriate but silent marriage." William hesitated. "And Frederick Morrison found true love with a young teacher in Bombay. We received an invitation to the wedding." Charlotte nodded, feeling only a soft pang of nostalgia for the turbulent days of her youth. The love they had built together surpassed all the dramatic passions of those early times. "Do you know what else impresses me?" she said, watching the children in the garden. "How our story changed not only our lives, but inspired other people to fight for their dreams." It was true. In the 5 years since their marriage, they had received dozens of letters from young couples who cited their courage as inspiration to defy arranged marriages and follow their hearts. That afternoon, as they walked together through the school gardens, Charlotte reflected on how the initial silence between them had transformed into a rich language of mutual understanding, respect, and growing love. "Do you have any regrets?" asked William, stopping to observe a rosebush they had planted in the first year of marriage. Charlotte looked at him, this man who had chosen love over convenience, truth over ease, courage over security, and smiled. "Only one," she said, leaning against his chest. "Regret for not being brave enough to declare my love sooner." The kiss they shared there, under the roses that witnessed 5 years of genuine happiness, sealed not only their past, but promised a future where love would continue to be their daily choice, renewed like the flowers that bloomed each spring in their garden. Brighton society, which had initially condemned them, had gradually learned to respect them, and many now cited their union as an example that the best marriages are born from mutual choice, not social obligation. As the sun set over the sea that bathed Brighton's coast, Charlotte understood that their story proved a simple but revolutionary truth. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is having enough courage to fight for it. Winter 1887, Christmas Eve. Snow was falling again over Brighton like that night of the ball 6 years before, but now each flake that danced against Ashford Mansion's windows brought with it memories of victories won rather than unrealized dreams. Charlotte was in the library, the same place where so many eloquent silences had been shared between her and William. She held in her hands a new letter. this time from a young woman named Elizabeth from Manchester, who wrote asking for advice on how to face family opposition to her love for a man of different social class. "Dear Mrs. Ashford," Charlotte read aloud, "your story reached us and gave us hope that true love can overcome all barriers. Please tell me, how did you find courage to defy the entire world?" William entered silently, as he always did, bringing 2 cups of hot chocolate that steamed in the cold library air. Even after 5 years of marriage, there was still in them that special quality of communication without words, that secret language developed through glances, gestures, and silences laden with meaning. "Another letter?" he asked, sitting in the armchair next to hers. "The 15th this month," Charlotte smiled. "Sometimes I think our little personal revolution had greater consequences than we imagined." William extended his hand and gently touched Charlotte's face, as he had done that first night when they almost kissed in front of the fireplace. The difference was that now there were no interruptions, no fears, no obstacles between them. "Do you know what moment I knew?" he asked. "Which moment?" "When I knew you would be the person I'd spend the rest of my life with. It was when I found your first annotations in the margins of the poetry book, not because they were intelligent or sensitive, but because they revealed a soul that understood that the most important words are sometimes those written between the lines." Charlotte closed Elizabeth's letter and turned completely toward William. After all these years, he still managed to make her feel as if it were the first time they were seeing each other. "For me," she said, "it was when I realized that our silences spoke louder than all the eloquent conversations I had with other people, that there was a language between us that needed no translation." At that moment, as if evoked by the conversation, their children's laughter arrived from upstairs, where they were playing with Mrs. Pemberton. James had inherited his father's contemplative intelligence, while Helena showed signs of her mother's fearless determination. The third baby, born in autumn and baptized Margaret in honor of her grandmother, slept peacefully in the cradle next to Charlotte's desk. "How will you respond to young Elizabeth?" asked William. Charlotte took the pen and dipped it in the inkwell, but hesitated before writing. "I'll tell her that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something is worth more than fear. That true love demands not only that we recognize when we find it, but that we be willing to fight for it, even when the whole world tells us it's impossible." She began to write, her handwriting flowing with the same elegance that had admired in William's annotations so many years before. "Dear Elizabeth, you ask how I found courage. The truth is that courage didn't come as a sudden revelation, but grew gradually, nourished by each small act of honesty with myself. First, I had to admit that I loved him. Then, that I deserved to be genuinely loved. Finally, that we were free to choose our own happiness." When she finished the letter, she handed it to William to read. He smiled with that expression she had learned to recognize as pride mixed with deep love. "We still write together," he said, "even when we're not physically writing together." Charlotte rose and walked to the window where snow continued falling. Outside, she could see the lights of the orphan school they had created, where dozens of girls slept in heated rooms instead of the cold and impersonal institutions that were common in the era. "William," she said softly, "sometimes I feel our story was just the beginning, that each couple that draws inspiration from our experience, each young person who finds courage to follow their heart, is a continuation of it." He approached from behind and wrapped her in his arms, both contemplating the snowy landscape that had witnessed so many decisive moments of their lives. "Then let it be so," he whispered in her ear. "Let our story continue in every heart that chooses love over convenience, in every soul that decides it's worth fighting for true happiness." In that moment, surrounded by the echoes of their past and the promises of their future, Charlotte understood the final truth of their journey. The silence they learned to share was not empty, but full of all the music that two souls can create when they finally find their perfect harmony. Snow continued falling outside, each flake unique and perfect, like each moment of love they built together, fragile individually, but capable of completely transforming the landscape when accumulated with patience and time. "Merry Christmas, my love," whispered Charlotte, turning in William's arms. "Happy life, my dear," he replied, and in the kiss they shared was contained all the promise that their love would continue growing, flourishing, and inspiring others through all the winters and springs yet to come.